Hi, in this video I am going to walk you through my code structure of this entire dashboard. So this is the default dashboard that user will get with the all US view. Now if we go to the code structure of the application, entire code base is available inside the facility dashboard folder. Uh, in the build folder, you will be having a build of the entire code base that you will going to deploy on the server. In node modules, all the dependencies are there that is being used. In the public, there is an index.html file. In index.html file, there is a div tag with the root id. This root is linked with the entire react.js code. So if you go inside the src folders index.js file, you can see that it is accessing that root element. Now index.js is the root component of our React tree. In index.js, I am using React router. So if user comes to the default URL, root URL, then the app component will be rendered, and if user comes with historic form or projected form, then according to that global URL object component will be rendered. Now if I go to for an example, user comes with global URL object. So for an example, user comes with the URL endpoint, then the global URL object component will be rendered. In global URL object, I am parsing the data present in URL and pass that data into main content component. As you can see, now in main content component is responsible to handle all the dynamic data on our web page, like historic and projected forms, map layer, table layer, and different charts. There is a header component as well. Header component is responsible for handling all the static files. So header component has all the static contents like about page, tutorial methods, frequently asked questions, everything. This form provider, state provider, user provider, and marker provider are the global context that I am using in this web application. Now let's go to the main. If user comes with the root URL, then the app component will be rendered as mentioned in the index.js file. So if I go to app content, then I know that if it's the request from the URL, that I will set the climate scenario, climate model, and an energy scenario with the default values, and then I will again going to use all the different contexts, and I will render the main content component with the property is URL is equal to false because the request is from the root. Now let me walk you through the entire component architecture and their interrelationships. So this is the entire architecture of the web application and components interrelationships. React has a unidirectional data flow. So you can see that a parent component is passing the properties to its children component as a prop. So in this application, I am passing the property as a is URL from parent app.js to its child main content component. So this is the key for the property, and it's the value is false in our example. So index.js is the root component. In that we have validated the if it's a root URL, then we will going to render the app.js component. If it's parameterized URL, then we'll render the global URL object component. They both have the common header component, which will going to render the static contents in our file. So in app.js as well, we are having a header component for handling the static requests. Now let me just walk you through the global context that I will be using. So these are the some of the global context that I am using in my application. URL change, input state context, projected form, query form, filters, and custom search. In the context directory, I will be having all the global context that I am using in the application. So let me just go through each and every context and give you the detail about what they are doing. So first context is the input state context. This is a global context which will be used by different components in an application. This context has three different states. The first state is the input state. So we know that whenever a user comes with the default URL, then the default view should be for the all US. So in input state, I will be having the region name as all US. The filter string is all. The filter string is basically the type of filters that user has provided. So default, it will be all filters will be checked. The filters is the array of different filters that we are providing options for. Each filter has its own unique ID and value. Initially, all the filters is checked as true because filter string is all. This context has three different methods. The first one is set input state, second one is set filter string, and set filters. So whenever user enters some new region and search for some new region from the application, then when user clicks on search button from the front end, then set input state function will be called, and now that function will going to update the input state value from all US to whatever is requested by the user. The set filter string and set filters is used to change the value for the type of filters that user has checked mark as true, and if user has unchecked some of the filters, then it will going to change the property is checked to false. Now we have created the context for this input state by using react.createContext method. So react.createContext will create the context, which is state context in this example, and in state context.provider, I am going to provide the value of the new input state, the filter string and filters to all the children component, and also provide the methods through which component can update these properties. Initially, we don't know the number of children which is going to use these properties. That is why I am just using children property of JavaScript, which will going to provide values to all the children components. The next global context is the marker context. So the marker context is used in the third layer of the map. So in my web application, if I go to some particular region's facility, then I can get a detail of different facilities through two ways. First way is I can click on a marker and it will going to open the info window for that particular facility, or I can click on the marker through like table. So if I click on any of the row in the table, then it will again going to open that particular marker. So if you see architecture, then we know that that uh, the marker the third layer of the map is inside the regions, the map content components, region component, and then marker component. Why? While our table content is inside the navbar, map control navbar, and table content. So if we use the traditional approach of React, then we need to pass all the properties through every components in between these two marker and table content components in order to provide communication between them. So to eliminate that issue, I am using the context API. So in this context API, I am storing the two value as in a global state. The first one is the marker data and the other one is the marker ID. So each and every marker, each and every facility that you can see on a map layer has the different ID associated with that. So whenever user clicks on some particular facility, then this global context is getting called and it will going to change the marker ID to whatever the facility that is being selected by the user. The marker data will be the data that resides inside that particular facility. So initially I am just providing marker ID as -1 and the marker data is equal to null because user has not clicked anything yet. But once user clicks in either from the table or from the map layer, then this particular context is getting called. For that we are providing like in marker context provider, I am providing marker ID, marker data, set marker data and set marker ID properties to both of these components. So that is why if you go back to app.js file, then that is why we have used marker provider inside the root directory, because we want to create a global context for that. The same will be inside the global URL object. The third global context is the projected form context. So if you go back to our application and if user clicks on a projected form, then we know that uh, there are three more properties added for state and facility layer. Those three properties are energy scenario, climate model, and climate scenario. To manage the state of these three components, I have created a context for that. So initially the climate scenario, climate model and energy scenario will be, the value will be like local storage dot get item, the value present in the local storage. That is the only reason why we are initializing the properties of climate scenario, climate model and energy scenario during our app.js. So if it's the root URL, then climate scenario, climate model and energy scenarios value will be the default one, and if it is coming from the URL, then we will going to set those values as per the content that is passed through URL. After that, this particular context gets called. As you can see, we are using the project provider in our application. Same for the app.js, I am using project provider. So when app.js or global URL object component is rendered, then it will going to call this project form context, and then that context will going to set the climate scenario, climate model and energy scenario value to whatever is defined in the local storage. It has also three different properties like set climate scenario, set climate model and set energy scenario, so that whenever user selects particular climate model, climate scenario, energy scenario from the front end side and click on a search button, at that moment we will going to set the value of this climate model and scenario and climate model uh, and update those values inside the local storage as well. So we will going to export these properties to all the children component in our application, so that it can be utilized to each and every layer of our application. And at last we have just exported our context. The third global context is the query form context. We are having two different ways, different forms through which user can perform different searches. One is the historic form, another is the projected form. Whenever user clicks on historic form, we want to display the entire dashboard based on the data provided in the historic form. So if I click on historic, then the particular date will get changed. In a projected form, the date will be changed to Jan to December 49 to 50. So in order to maintain those states and change the UI according to the form selected by the user, I have created one global context for form selection. So the default will be the historic form, because whenever user comes with the root URL, the historic form will be opened. There is another method called set form. Whenever user clicks on another button, then it will going to call the set form context, which will going to change the value of the selected form, so that we know that which particular form is selected, and based on that we can provide the entire dashboard. It has two properties as form and set form. Set form will going to help to uh, set the set the new value of the form that is being selected by user, and the form is the value of that selected form. So at last we have exported that form provider. The next global context is the update context. This global context is basically used to provide borders uh, in the map layer of all US as well as in a state layer. For an example, whenever users hovers over the particular region, you can see that a border of that region is getting highlighted with a green color. Or whenever user hovers over a particular row in a table, then also that particular region is getting highlighted in the map layer. So in order to provide communication between the table content and the map layer, I have created one global context. In that context, we have particularly two properties. One is the region and another is the store state. Hence, whenever whenever user hovers over the particular row, uh, this context will take uh, the name of that particular region. So when I hover over this rows, I am in a context, this set region method gets called, and it will set the value inside the context with the state name in this example. So in this case it's Alabama. So we're going to store that in a region, and then the map layer will will get the value of that particular region and highlight that particular area in the map layer. The same applies to when we hover over particular region in the map layer. So when I hover over the particular region, again this context gets called, and it will going to change the value of a region and highlight that particular area. So here, as you can see, the state layer and state layer and all US layer is rendered inside the state watershed and county layer of map, and we are hovering over the table content which is inside the navbar. So in order to provide communication between table content and county layer, like and all US and state layer of the map, I have created a context. Otherwise I would have to pass the props from table to the regions, like table, navbar, map control, map content, regions components. So to eliminate that, I am using the context API. Hence, these are the different components that is being used in this application. Now, let's get back into our app.js file. So if the URL is the root URL, then I am storing the climate model, climate scenario, and energy scenario to its default value, and I will be importing all the different context providers. So like projected provider for projected form context, form provider for like form context for the to keep track of the type of form that is being selected. State provider has the like state that is currently being searched by user and the filter string. uh, for the user provider, it will going to highlight the particular region in the map layer whenever user hovers its mouse of in all US and state layer. Marker provider is used on the third layer of the map with the facility. So whenever user clicks on some row in table, then it should open the info window on the map layer for that particular marker. Same applies to uh, same applies to another object that I have created, which is global URL object. Whenever user comes in with the URL, then we will need this common context, but at that time our is URL property will be true. and we will pass all the contents present in the URL. So as you can see, the global URL object is also calling main content component, and app.js is also rendering the same component main content. So main content is a component that is responsible to render the entire dynamic content of our web application, including the query form, different forms based on the selected form, the map layer, and the table, charts, and everything. So if you go back to our chart, then you can see that so the main component is responsible for handling all the dynamic requests. So global URL object and app.js will render this main component in our application. This main component will render the radio button component, which is the top button that we are having historical projected, the form control method, like which will take the values inside each and every form, uh, then map control component which will be rendering map and different charts. If I go into the main content component, then it will going to first of all call the constructor method. In the constructor method, it will get all the props that it has received from its parent components. In our example, the main contents components parents are either the global URL object component or the app.js component. So if through the props, if it has the URL present, so uh, if the user has come with the URL, then I will need to set certain properties and make changes accordingly. For an example, I will need to store the local storage from URL is equal to true. Uh, the I will take all the contents like passed in the URL, and according to that I will going to make changes in my entire application based on the type of contents present in the URL. So once for an example, the type of form, if it's historic form, then I will need to call the context that I have created for the query form context query form context set form method will be called with the new type of form that is being requested by the user. The view by choice, display by choice in a map layer, like the climate scenario, energy scenario. So each and every detail will be taken uh, at at that moment, uh, and the context will be updated. For an example, as we can get the type of filters that's being requested by the user, and we can just set our context value and call our context to update the filters, like the set of filters that is being requested by the user, the type of state that is we will also need to update the input state as well in our context. So if the form type will be historic, then we know that our historic start date and historic end date will be changed uh, as as it is passed from the URL. So if that particular once we change that, and if like once we change that, then we need to again set the initialize the state of this particular component with those values. So if it is the projected, then we know that we need to change the projected start and projected end date. So that is why then I will like we will call the this dot state method, which will going to initialize uh, uh, the objects with the default values provided by the user in URL. If it is not from URL, then we will set the default values in this component. uh, in main content component, these are the different methods that I need to bind inside the component in order to use those methods. We will go into these methods in a later stage. After the constructor uh, getting called, then the component will be rendered and components render method will be called. In that case, we will going to check whether the coming request is from URL or not. If it is from URL, then we know that we need to update the values inside a global context. So in React, when you try to update the context value, then it takes uh, two React lifecycle to update the value. So initially, it is not making any sense to render all the children component with the old values. So that is why I have created a loader in which, if the request is coming from URL, then I will just show loading on my front page, and then after the render method, it will again going to call the component did mount method. So in component did mount method, I will going to check whether the request is from URL or not. If it is from URL, then I know I will make again it as false, because now I have all the update. Now at during the component did mount, I will be having the updated values from the context, and then I will set state that initial loader is true. like uh, like so as I am having the this dot set state method in the component did mount, uh, hence it will again going to re-render this main content component. But this time, when we perform the re-rendering of the component, we will be having the updated values that we have settled on the context. So again the render method will be called, but during that time, uh, uh, we will be having the form URL value as false. So at that time we will going to render our entire application with the updated values. So through this approach, we can optimize the code and perform, we can make our application more performance prominent. Main content component then renders the query form container component, form control, and the map control components. So let's get back into the architecture. As you can see, the main component in our application, we're going to render the query form component, which is the type of form selection radio button component. Then the second one is the form control component, which will be having the historic form and projected forms. The map control component, which will be having the map content and the different chart view. If you go to the query form component, then this component will be having the different forms, different radio buttons. So uh, so currently the in initial like this query form controller has a its local state, which is a selected choice. So we will need the value of the type of form that is being selected by the user from the context that we have created, which is a query form context. So query form context will provide the type of form that is being currently requested by the user. So we will initialize this component with that selected option method. In the render method, you can see we have created two different radio buttons. One is for historic and another is for the projected form. Whenever user clicks on one of this particular form, then the selected item method will be called, and based on that we will going to set our form with the new values, and we will again going to call we will again update the value inside the value inside the form context with the new value of a form. At that time, we also need to perform like set marker data to null and set marker id to -1, because for an example, if user is at the third layer of the map, and if he has requested to or if he has clicked on a particular facility, at that time in our marker component we will be having the value of this particular facility and its id. At that time, if user clicks on a projected form, then we need to again reset the marker component, because at this time we will be having the different data for that particular facility. So that is why I have used the marker component over here, which will going to call set the new values in the marker context. So this is all about the query form component. The next component is the form control component, which is responsible to render the different types of forms based on the uh, form selected by the user. So the form control component is taking the start date, end date, and the but select like the type of option that is being selected by the user. It is also taking the form handler method that we have created in the main content component. So if I go inside the form control component, then you can see that if the currently, like in a form context, if currently the selected form is historic, then we will need to render the historic form component, and if the current selected form is projected, then we need to call the projected form component in that case. So we are getting the value from the query form context that we have created. It also has two different methods for historic form handler and projected form handler. So historic form handler is a method which gets called whenever user clicks on a search button in a historic form, and the projected form handler method will be called whenever user clicks on search button in a projected form. So we will pass this method in historic form. In historic form we are passing the historic form handler method, and in projected form we are passing the projected form handler method. For that we also need to bind those method in our component. So that is why here I have binded those particular methods. If the currently requested form is a historic form, then the historic form component will be rendered. If we go inside the historic form a component, then we will be having the entire historic form. So this historic form component has a constructor method. In a constructor method, I am going to take the historic start date, historic end date. Currently, the input state, like the default, will be the all US, and the all the filter string will be all initially. These are the different methods that I have binded inside the historic form component. I will go through these methods in later. After the constructor getting called, the render method will be called, and during the render method I will be going to uh, 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 render the entire historic form during that time. So this is the custom search component that I have created in order to provide the searching functionality in a historic form. The reason I have created it as a separate component, because we are searching for a particular region both in historic form as well as in projected form. So in that case, we can just reuse this custom search component. So that is the great functionality provided in React, that you can reuse the same component again for the uh, different purposes. So in his custom search, I will going to pass the input text as like as a prop with the name entered by the user. So whenever user enters for a particular region, for an example, if user click on California and just clicks on it, then the custom search method will be called, and it will going to search for that particular region and provide the searching functionality. Select start and year from like this component will date picker component will be used to provide the start date and month and year, and end month and year in historic form. Filter model for historic, like this particular component is responsible to provide the different filter functionality in a historic form. So whenever user clicks on filter by field types and checks or unchecks particular filters, then this component is responsible for that. As we are using the filter by field type in both historic and projected form, I am going to reuse filter by field type component in both the historic as well as in projected form. Then the search method and the reset view button to perform searching and or to reset the entire view in our application. Now when user clicks on a search button in a historic form, then form control method will be called. That is why we have binded these methods inside the historic form. The form control method will going to take all the inputs that user has entered in a form control. So if user has entered like California state, the start date, end date, like filter by different filters, everything will be taken inside the form control event, and it will going to take those values uh, inside one array, and it will going to call the historic form handler method that we have created in the parent component. So if it will going to create the this dot props dot historic form handler method, uh, which we have created in a parent component form control. So historic form handler will be called with and in that argument we will be having all the new values that we have passed in the historic form. So if again I go back to the form control component, in a historic form handler method, it will going to take all the values that we have passed. So now the historic form handler will going to call the form handler method that we have created in the form controls parent component, which is the main content component. So the if I go to the main content component, it is having a form handler method. So that is why we have binded the form handler inside a main content component. So the form handler will going to check whether the selected form, like whether it's a historic form or a projected form. Then if it's a historic form, then we know that we need to change the historic input start date, input state, the start date, end date, filter string. If it's a projected form, then it knows that we need to change the like projected start date, projected end date, in state input state name, filter string, energy scenario, climate scenario, and climate model. uh, so after settling the like after setting up the new values in the main content component, this main content will be re-rendered again. Before the re-rendering, component should component update method will be called, and it will check if uh, the the values that being passed by the user, if it's same as the previous values, then it will just return false and it will stop re-rendering of the component. And if it is not the same values, then it will return true, and which it will allow component to re-rendering. This is how we perform optimization in this application, and we will then render all the children components. The same thing is applied to the projected form component. So if the selected form is a projected form, then we will be going to render the projected form. In the projected form, I will be having uh, the same. The first of all, the constructor method will be called with all the default values as start date, end date, input state, and filter string. In the render method of a projected form, I will be having the entire projected form where user can select the particular energy scenario, uh, particular climate scenario, and climate model. So for the climate model, the value of the climate model depends solely on the type of climate scenario that is being selected by the user. So if I go to the climate model component, in climate model, I am first of all taking if the currently selected climate scenario is RCP 45. So if I go back to my application and if I go back to the projected form, then if the currently selected climate scenario is 45, then I know that I need to render the climate model based on the values present in the climate scenario drop down. So in that case, I will going to render the climate model 45, and if it's RCP 85, which is the second climate scenario type, then it will going to render all the options inside the RCP 85 climate scenario. So the climate model will be rendered, and whenever user clicks on particular climate model, then this particular projected form context will be called, and it will set the new value for that climate model. Now once it sets the new value inside the climate model method, and then if user clicks on a search button inside the projected form, then again the form control will be called, and it will going to set the new values, and it will call the projected form handler method uh, in the form control component, as we are calling the historic form handler from the historic form in the projected form handler method for the from the projected form. So now if I go to form control, we are having a projected form handler method. It will going to take all the values that we have entered inside the projected form and pass those values inside the form handler method in a main content. So in main content, it will going to again call the form handler method, and at this time it will going to again reset the, like it will again going to set the new state inside that component and uh, re-render the entire main content with the new value. Once the main content component will be re-rendered with the new values provided in a particular form, it will going to render the map control component. Before going to the map control component, let me just go through the some of the methods that I mentioned inside the historic form as well as in the projected form. So entire the form in a form control directory, I will be having the entire code base for the different forms. If in historic form, if user clicks on a reset button, user click on the reset view button, then it should then reset the entire view of the web page. So in that case, I will again going to call the set marker ID and set the marker to -1 and null, and I will again going to change the, I will again just re-render the entire page with the default values for the historic form. Same applies to the projected form. Whenever user clicks on the reset button, then it will going to call uh, the project. It will going to just reset the entire view of for the projected form. So this is how the form control method and the different forms are being handled in this application. If I go to the main content component again, then it will going to call the map control component with the new values. So in the map control, we know that it will going to take the climate scenario, climate model, energy scenario, the type of form that is currently being selected, the filter string that we will going to pass to call the different API endpoints, the type of filters that's being currently selected, then history, start date, end date, the input state name currently, and the map handler method. These are the different props that we will going to pass to our children components. So after that, the map control component will be rendered. So if we go back to our architecture, then the map content map main component, we have gone through the query form component, the form control component where we have rendered the historic form and the projected form. From that, we have called the map control component. So right now we are at the map control component, which is responsible to render the map view, and in the right side it is responsible to render the navbar component, where it is rendering the table data and the different charts for our application. In map control component, I am rendering two different components, which is one is the map content component, which is responsible to render the Google Maps in a web application, and the navbar component, which is responsible to render the table and different charts in our application. So first of all, in map control component, the constructor method will be called, and I have binded several methods in this component. So the view by button click method, for an example, is getting called whenever user clicks something on a map layer. So if user clicks on states, then we know that our application should render the all US view in a projected form. So to keep track of those clicks, I have created view button click method. In that, I am going to keep track of what particular view by button is being clicked by the user, and based on that, I am rendering the new view inside the web application. Inside the form handler 2 and form handler 3 method, like they all these three methods going to call the map handler method inside the main content. So as you can see, like uh, whenever user clicks on particular region on map, for an example, if user clicks on Oregon state, then it will going to call the form handler method inside the map control component, and that map control component will again call the map handler method that we have defined in a main content component. So the map handler method will again going to take the new name for the region that user has clicked on, and based on that, it will going to change the historic input state So once it is changed, then it will going to reflect that particular state name inside the form, and as well as will render the new data for that particular region. Then after performing the rendering, uh, it will go, first of all, it will our we will be having the loader as a, in a map control component will be having the loader value as of uh, loader value as false. So if the loader is false, then we will then the component did mount will be called, and during the component did mount I will be calling the different API endpoints to get the data for that particular region. The data that I will be receiving in this map control component will be used in a table component as well as in a map layer in our application. Here we are getting the data in map control component using the async await functionality in ES6, which will provide the asynchronous data fetch in React. Once the data is loaded, we will going to set the loader is true. So once the data is loaded, the loader will be set to true, and then it will going to again re-render the component, and during that time it will be having the new values from the APIs that we have called, and then it will going to call the map content as well as the neighbor component with the new values that it has received. This is how we have performed the optimization in map control component by rendering the map control component only once for each and every request. To fetch the different data based on the region requested by the user, there are different API endpoints for each and every type of region selected by user. So if the region is all US, then based on that the particular endpoint will be called. In the particular endpoint we can see that I have created I have taken the start year, start month in int, start year, end year, and end month in end month, as well as the type of filters that's being requested by the user. So same, if it is a state, then there are chances that the user has selected watershed in a view by form. So for an example, if user has selected watershed and if it performs the searching, then it should render the new view by selecting the watershed as a view by. So at that time I need to check whether the selected option is watershed, counties, or a facility, because we need to store the state of the view by form. If it is a this is for the historic form, and if the selected form is a projector, then we need to perform the same thing for that as well. Now the map content component will be rendered, and the navbar will be rendered with the new values that we have received from the parent component of a map control. So inside the map content component, I have the entire code base to render the Google Maps. So first of all, in its initialized state in a constructor, I will be having the default values. The longitude and latitude initially is for the all US data. The states will be selected in a view by choice initially. There are several methods that I have binded inside the map content component. We will go through this method in later stage. Now, after the map content component will be rendered, uh, it will go into it will be having the two different types of forms that we will be using. The first form will be the display by form. So this is the Google map that we will be rendering. In that we will pass the different properties. For the center we will pass the latitude and longitude, the zoom level that we want to perform, and all the other important things. It is going to use the regions component. So the regions component is responsible to uh, render different layers of maps based on the request. So if user has requested for all US, then the regions component will take the all US as a input state and render the data for the all US view. on the top of the Google map. Same for the state layer and the facility layer. Apart from that, uh, it is having a display form. In a display form, we'll be having the water consumption, water withdrawal, and emission properties. Whenever user clicks on any of this display by form, then the display item method will be called. In display item method, we need to call the URL change method. In the URL change is a global method that is being used by all the components which is inside the global util directory. So the URL util will going to call the window object and change the URL based on the type of display button, like display button clicked by the user, and the display by choice state will be called, and the new value will be updated based on the based on the selection made by the user. After that, the entire component will be re-rendered with the new display by content, and the view on the map layer will be changed. Now, if it's same for the view by form, if in the view by form, if user has selected particular view by button, if you selected for an example from watershed to counties, then we know that we need to update our like the table data as well as our map view with the new borders for the counties for that particular region. So if user clicks on any of the particular view by, then we will call the view by item method in the map content component. In view by item, we will going to again update our view by choice, a view by choice as a new selected option, and the entire component will be re-rendered. At that time, we will also going to set the isClick property of this component as true. So after the isClick will be true, then the component did update method will be called of a map content, and at that time we will be having the previous props, and then like component did update method has the two argument. The one is the previous property, next is the previous state and the snapshot. So so at that time we will be having the same input state in a properties and the same start date and end date, but we know that user has clicked on a view by button. So in this we will going to check if everything is same but user has clicked on the view by button, then it should render the new region, new borders on the map layer. So at that time we will be calling the different API endpoints to update the borders on Google Maps. So once the new GeoJSON data will be called, we will set the isClicked property as false, and we will update the view by choice as the type of view by button clicked by the user. So after we will be having the new GeoJSON data, after having the new GeoJSON data, again the uh, the map content component will be re-rendered, but during that time when it will going to call the regions component, and in the regions component we will pass the new GeoJSON data that we received in a component readbound method. Once the new GeoJSON data being rendered by the component in component did update method, we will again call the view by button click method from our parent, which is a map control component, and we will pass the new particular view by choice created by the entered selected by the user. In that view by choice, I will be having the new view by choice and as well as the state that is currently user at. So in the map control component, I will be having the view by button click method as we discussed earlier. So in view by button click method, I will going to check what kind of view by choice made by the user, and based on that view by choice I will going to render the data accordingly. So for an example, in an application, if user clicks on watershed, then the parent map control component will be called and it will going to fetch the watershed details and the new borders for the watershed. So as you can see, the table data is also getting reflected uh, with the with the new data for the watersheds. Apart from this, uh, in map content component, uh, we are having a back button through which we can perform the transitions. So this is the display by, the view by. So for the back button, for example, if user again clicks on the up to all US view, then again we need to go back to the all US view. For that, I have created another component called back component, which is responsible to provide functionalities layers of the map. So as you can see now, we have re-rendered the uh, we rendered the data for the all US again after clicking on the back button. But we know that the all US is the first layer of the map, so we will not need the back button in the all US layer. So that is why I am performing this dot state dot preview state. So if it is a if the current state of the input state is all US, then my previous state will be null. So if it is null, then it will not going to render anything. But if it is not null, if it is the state layer or the facility layer, then in my previous state I will be having the previous stored state. At that time only I will going to render this back component. After that, I am going to also render the Google map with the maps. If I go to the back button component, then it has all the logic regarding the back button functionality. So in the back button, I am having a button component that I am using from the material UI for the React, and in the back button component, I will be checking if the previous state is present, and if it is all US, then I know that I will need to get the data for the entire all US. If it is not all US, then I know that I need to get the data for the state layer. And this is the label that I am providing up to the value inside the previous state. Here I will be using the marker context, a global context as well, because if user has if user is in the third layer of the map, for an example, and if user has clicked on a particular marker, and during that time if uh, user performs the clicks on the back button, then at that time also I need to uh, create, if I again I need to set the marker ID as -1 and marker data as null. If you go to the again the map content component, the next component that is being rendered is a regions component. So regions component is responsible to render the different colors on a map layer. So get the once we get the GeoJSON data for the particular region, then the regions component will be called. In the regions component, initially we will be having, we will get all the values that we have received from the props from the parent component. There are different methods that we have binded inside this component. Now when the render method getting called, then we will check if the view by choice is facilities, then we know that we need to render the third layer of the map, which will going to render all the facilities on the map layer. At that time we will going to call the URL change method with all the values that we have received. Here we are using the GeoStats library, which will going to provide the different if the facilities is selected, then it will going to provide the different radius for markers based on the values provided inside the data. So the more the value, the more the radius, the lesser the value, the lower the radius of the marker. Now, if the particular view by choice is not the facilities, then we know that we need to render either the all US layer, or we need to render the state layer. So if the property is view by choice is not facilities, for an example, if the view by button is not the facilities, then we know that we need to render either the state layer or the all US layer. At that time, we need to take the GeoJSON data that I have received from the parent component, and based on that GeoJSON data, I will going to take the coordinates for each and every state layer, and I will going to call the state layer component with that GeoJSON data and with the latitude and longitude of each and every region. So in state layer, we're going to render each and every region on a map. If I am in the South Dakota state, the state layer will going to render each and every watershed component. So the, the region that you are seeing right now highlighted is a one state layer component. There is another state layer component for the different regions. So for Crow watershed, for Randall Reservoir watershed, Lake Thompson watershed, there will be different state components for each and every boundaries. So in a state layer, we will going to render. So that is why we are going to use the context that we have created to highlight the border as a green color. In state layer, I will be using that context. From that context, I will be getting the name of the region that user is currently hovered on. So whenever user hovered on the particular region, the context will be called with the name of that particular watershed, and that particular component or state layer component will be called, and it will going to highlight that region with the green color. So that is why on mouse over functionality, I am going to call the set region method, in which I am passing the name of the region. So this is the polygon component that I am using, which is inside the Google Maps. So React Google Maps provides a polygon component which is responsible to render different state layers in this application. Stroke color is used to provide the different like border colors inside our map. So if that is selected, if particular is selected, the stroke color will be green, but if it is not, then the stroke color will be the region color method inside the state layer component is responsible to render the different colors inside the each and every regions. So for an example, if emission is selected, then we know that we need the values inside the emission, uh, like in the table. So we will going to take the value inside the emissions, and based on the value, we are providing different colors on top of the map layer. For that, I am taking the region color method. In the region color method, I will check if the display by choice is water consumption. Then I will going to call the get range number, and I will going to take the value of the water consumption for that particular region. So for an example, I am on uh, Lower Beak watershed, then the value of Lower Beak like watershed emission is 2,33,167, which is much higher than the other regions. So at that time, I will know that I need to render the dark color in that particular region. So if it is emission, then it will going to take the name of the region and the emission value of that particular region, and it will going to call the map color palette hex. So the map color palette hex is responsible to return the different hexagon values for the uh, uh, like for the regions. So g.get number is the geostate libraries object, and it has one method called get range number, in which when you call the get range number method of a geostate library and pass the value of the emission, it will going to render, it will going to get you uh, the domain in which that particular value is resides in, and based on that particular value, we will be going to call the particular map color palette hex method, which will going to return the hexagon color for that particular region. So we will be doing this for counties, for watershed, as well as on all US layer. So as you know now that we are using the state layer component to provide the different colors on top of the GeoJSON data that we received from a map content component. If user clicks on any of the particular region from map layer, then we know that we need to call the we need to render the data for that particular region. So for that I have created the onClick method. So if the current state is all US, then and if user clicks on particular region, then I know that I will first call the URL change method, which will going to change the URL with the new selected region, and during that time I will going to render the particular state, and I will then call the form handler method in a on a parent component. The form handler, so further in a region we will be having the form handler method that we have binded. In form handler I will going to take that particular region that user has requested, and it will again going to call the parent component's form handler method. So the regions component's parent component is a map content component, and in map contents form handler method it will going to, if it is all US, then it will going to call the form handler method of the map contents parent component, which is a map control. So in map controls form handler, we are going to take the new state that's being requested by the user by clicking on the map layer, and we will pass that particular state in the main content component. So in main content, we will going to call the map handler method. In map handler method, we will going to set the new state and to change the value of that historic input state. Then the new state will be changed, and it will going to again re-render the entire main entire components with the new UI. So when I click on any particular region, then the map content will be called. From the map content it will going to call the main content. In map main content it will going to change the data in the inside the form, and it will going to re-render the entire new UI based on the data requested by the user. Same is for the state. If currently is the state, then we will first of all going to change the URL, and once the URL is changed, I will again going to call the parent component's form handler for facility method. So state layer's parent component again is a regions. In the regions I have a method called form handler for facility, which will going to render the different facilities inside that particular watershed or county. In map content I will be having this particular method, and it will again going to call the uh, the map handler method inside the main content, and for it will going to again re-render the new UI. So now again if we go back to the architecture, we know that like from the main component we have rendered the map control. From map control we call the map content to render the Google Maps. To render the different colors on a Google Maps, I have called the regions component. From regions component, there is another component called state layer component, which is responsible to render the different colors. Once the state layer has rendered different colors on the top of Google Maps, whenever user clicks on particular region, we will going to pass the information, the name of that particular region, again back to the regions component. From regions we are passing that value to map content to map control, and map control to again main component, which is the parent component of all the components. So the main component, it will going to reflect the changes in all its children component and re-render the entire new UI. Now in regions component, marker component is responsible to render the third layer of a Google map. So if I go to the regions component again, and if the facilities is selected, then uh, uh, then I know that I will call the URL change method, which with the new view by button clicked by the user, and during that time I will going to get the data for all the facilities, and for the geostate library I am going to get the uh, radius of each and every marker. After that, for each and every facility that I have got, I will going to create a like a separate index for each and every facility as a key, and for that each key I am going to call the custom marker component that I have created. So for each and every facility that I will be rendering, it has the custom marker with the unique ID and the facility name. So for that, and again I will be having one button, like whenever user clicks on like show more detail, then it will going to render the facility chart for that particular selected facility. So for an example, if I go back to the application, if user clicks on particular facility and clicks on show details, then the particular facility chart will be rendered. So facility chart component is responsible to render the line chart for that particular facility, and the close button is responsible, like when we click on the close button, that it is going to close that particular chart. uh, so this is all about the regions component, which is responsible to render the different markers on a on a map for the facilities and different regions for all US and state layer. In custom marker component, I will be using the marker component of Google Maps, which is going to render the each and every facility markers. It has a set radius method, which is going to take the value of a display by choice. Based on that, I will be rendering the different radius for the facilities. I am again going to use the geostate library, which will going to get me the different radius for that particular markers. As I mentioned earlier, each and every marker will be having the different indices. So if I go back to the regions component, I am passing the index as a marker ID and the array index with the index. So each and every facility will be having the separate index and the custom. So for each and every facility will be rendering the custom marker component. Now in marker, whenever user, each and every marker has their own latitude and longitude that we are taking, and while when user clicks on the particular marker, then uh, we will be like we will fetch the data for that particular facility and all the information about the selected facility, and we will show those information inside the info window component. So if the selected markers index is same as the facility clicked on, the like if user clicks on particular facility, when user clicks on particular facility, then we need to check whether the click facility has the same indices in index as the like the index present inside this custom marker component. Then only it will going to pop up only the info window for that particular marker, and it will going to fetch all the information about that marker. So it has a show button called the show details. Whenever user calls on the show details, it will going to call the model open method of its parent component, which is the regions. So region as a model open model open method, which is going to display the facility chart. So once uh, so is model open will be true whenever user click on a model open. So once user click on the is model true, then we know that we will going to render the facility chart for that particular component. So facility chart component I have created, which is responsible to render the facility chart. It is using the chart.js to render the particular facility chart for that particular selected facility. So this is how the entire regions component is working. In regions component, we have used the two contexts. The one context is for the marker, the third layer of the map, and the other is the first and second layer of the map. So whenever user clicks on any particular facility, then we know that we need to uh, open the info window for that particular facility. For that, I have created the marker global context API, and the other context API is for to highlight the regions inside the regions component with the green color. So these are the two context APIs that I have used in the uh, regions component. So if I go back to the architecture, then we have gone through the map control components, map content responsible to render the GeoJSON data for the Google Maps. it will again going to render the regions, which will going to render the different colors on a map. And like in a state layer, it will going to uh, fetch the different colors for the state layer, the all US and the state layer. Whenever user clicks on something, that it will pass the data till the main component, and the entire react will be like an entire cycle will be re-rendered. The regions also responsible to render the marker component for the third layer of the map, and it is also rendering the facility chart whenever user clicks on the show details component. So this is all about the map content component. The navbar component is a child component of map control, which is responsible to render the right side of our application. So the entire table, pie chart, bar chart, and line chart, all these four components are children component of a navbar component. So the data that we have received from a map control component will be passed to the navbar component, and that navbar component will re-render the all these four components. So if we go to the navbar component, then it will going to render the four different components for the table. The second one is for the pie chart, bar chart, and for the line chart. For the line chart, we need to know like whether the particular particular input state entered by the user, if it is all US or not, because we are not showing the line chart for the all US. So based on that, the particular component will be rendered. In navbar component, we are having two states. First is the active item, which is the active tab. So for an example, whenever user for an example, user is on a pie chart, and if user clicks on back button, then we know that we need to store the currently active state, that the currently active tab that user has selected for that, because that is why, like, if user clicks on the back button, then again we will store the state that user has selected for this component. So that is why we have created the active item, and the items is you will get the data that we have received from the map control component. So if I go to the map control component, and if I go to the render method, in the navbar we are passing the table data. So table data is basically the data that we received from the API call, and we will pass that data in our table component to display those data inside table. So if we go to the table content component, it will going to render the table for us. So in each and every row, we will be having a separate index, and when we mouse over the particular region, then we will going to call that global context that we have created to highlight that particular region on map with the green color. So when I hover over the particular region, then it will going to call that particular global context with the region name, and it will highlight that particular region with the green color. So that is how I have performed the communication between map layer and the table layer. Now, if the user has selected, if it is the third layer of the map, then we know that we need to whenever user clicks on particular row, we need to provide the info window for that particular facility. For that, I have used the context that I have created, the marker context. Whenever user clicks on particular facility for particular row on the third layer, then it will going to call that particular context and will store the marker ID and the marker data on in that particular context. So if I'm in the third layer of the map, and if I click on particular facility, then it will going to show the info window for that particular facility. For that, I have created I'm using the context that I have created, and apart from that, the table content will be used to render the table data. Now in navbar component, we have the toggle method, So whenever user clicks on particular tab, then the toggle method will be called and the active ID will be changed for that particular component. So for an example, if I click on pie chart, then the active ID will be changed and it will going to show me the pie chart for the uh, selected region. So now if I go back to the pie chart, then in my render method I will be calling the pie chart. Here I am using the chart.js to render the pie chart. So these all are the default values for the pie chart that will be changed once we get the data from the APIs. So the pie chart will be having the component did mount method, which which will just call the different API endpoints to render the pie chart data. So if the form is historic and if it is all US, then we call the all pie chart data for the all US. Same for the state, county, or the watershed. Same for the projected. If the selected form is projected, then it will going to render the pie chart for those fetch the data for that particular region. I am again here calling the async await functionality, and it will going to fetch the data and store it into the items state, which is a local state. So once the data is once it gets the data, then the pie chart will be called, and in pie chart I will be taking the all the filters. If the for each and if it's emission, then I will take the pie chart data for each and every uh, types. So we are showing the pie chart for generation, emission, consumption, and withdrawal. So I will be taking all the data for those particular types inside the different objects. So my state, my set 2, my set 3, and my set 4 is will going to take the data for each and every type. After getting the data, I will be taking the labels. In the labels, I will be having the different filters that user has selected. After settling the labels and the data, we just need to pass that in our py component of the chart.js. In the data, we will be going to pass the data that we have received from our API, and in options, like we will be pass some of our customized configurations of the pie chart. So if I go back up and in options, you can see like there are some basic configuration I have provided. So that is how pie chart will be rendered. Uh, from the navbar, the bar chart will be rendered with the similar manner. In the bar chart also, we will be calling the different API endpoints based on the selected region, and after like with the async await, we will fetch the data for the bar chart, and we will render the we will going to render the bar chart data uh, uh, with the help of the bar component provided by the chart.js. Uh, uh, from now from the line chart is line chart gets changed whenever the user uh, also change the in a projected form. Whenever user change the value from the climate model or climate scenario, line chart component will be re-rendered at that time as well. So apart from that, it is working the similar manner as pie chart and line chart, pie chart and bar chart. So in component did mount, if the form is projected and if it is a state, then I need to check the particular kind of climate model that is being selected by the user. Based on the climate model, I will going to call the particular API endpoint for the line chart. Same for the county and watersheds, I will be calling the different API endpoints. Now, after getting the data from those API endpoints, I will going to store that data in the local state of that component, and that entire line chart component will be re-rendered, and it will going to render the line chart. So in the line chart uh, is the same, like it will be going to render me the it will going to give me the month wise summary for month wise summary data, where I will be having the data for each and every month and year. So based on that, my line chart will be rendered, and I will process the data for each and every year, and for each year I will be processing the data for every month. I will store the data inside one object, and I will pass that in the line component from chart.js, and it will going to render the line chart. So for an example, in this, as you can see, I can get the data for each and every month from 2049 January to 2015 December. So it is fetching the data for each and every month of the year and each year. Uh, so this is how the line chart works in this application. So that is how the each and every component in this application is interrelated with each other. Now we are just left with the static components that I have created. In the header component, we are rendering all the static contents. So if I again go back to the app.js, I am rendering the header component to render the static data. So in the header component, I will be having the four different components. One is the about, FAQs, tutorials, and methods. Each and every component is responsible to render the static contents. So home is the default view of the web application. So apart from that, if someone clicks on uh, uh, about tab, then we will going to call the handle click method of the header component, and the handle click will going to render the change the model name and uh, change the state of the header component, and based on the requested value we will going to render the particular component. So this is the like blob image for the symbol that I am showing. I am displaying in the right side of the uh, application. So this EWED is the, this is how in is this is the SVG format of that logo. So based on the uh, uh, based on the click requested by the user, the particular component will be rendered. So if the model name is about and is it open, then we will going to call the about component. About component will be having all the basic information about this project. Same for the different components. So if I again go back to the header component, if it is FAQs, then it will going to render the FAQ component. Same for the tutorials and methods. So in FAQs, we will be having all the frequently asked questions. For tutorials, there will be tutorial to how to navigate through this application and all the other information about this application. Same for the fourth component. The methods component will be having the different methods that's being used in this project and the references. So this is how this web application works. We will be having the static components, global context for the context API, and all the other dynamic components. Thank you.